My name is Jeff Sherlock, and I've spent the past 7 years working at Facebook and Pinterest on a variety of projects and products that all interface with data in one way or another. And I'm here to tell you about some of the ways that data works really well and data is imperfect when making product decisions, and some of the failures that I've personally encountered along the way. So my background, I studied at the University of Utah. Don't worry, I come to Utah County in peace. I'm not here to start any wars or anything. I studied computer science and sociology. After I graduated, I was an engineer at a couple of companies in downtown Salt Lake for 4 or 5 years. And then in 2011, I joined Facebook in their New York office as an engineer working on the Facebook platform and open graph projects. After a couple of years there, I had the opportunity to join Pinterest when it was about 80 people. And I moved out to San Francisco, and they were like, we need a growth product manager. I didn't know anything about growth, but I was like, that sounds great, and dove right in. And after doing that for a couple of years, they were like, now we're gonna start to try and make money. And so they put me in charge of building out all the ads relevance, ad serving, ad targeting stuff from scratch. And so that was a really, really big challenge. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And in my last year or so, I also helped them build out an ads data science team. And as of last week, I joined Degreed, working on data and personalization downtown Salt Lake. So that's kind of my full circle back to Utah. Back to that, this notion of data. I don't think I have to like spend too much time, drilling this point home. Like, there's a whole company across the freeway that like can produce 1 billion really, really pretty graphs like this. Data is incredibly powerful. Like, I think back to what it must have been like to be a marketing manager or a logistics manager working at Sears like 100 years ago. And if you wanted to know like how many lawnmowers you sold in Idaho or how many hammocks you sold in Louisiana last year, like it was like not knowable. Like maybe in the order of years you could compile that data by hand from like regional managers, and then it would make its way to central office, and then someone would have to like hand tabulate those things. And now if I told you that it would take years to answer that question, like you'd be laughed out of the room, right? Like that's like a, maybe hours, max days kind of question for anyone that's running an organization like that. And I think that this plot's kind of interesting. This was something I pulled together with a couple friends during a hackathon at Pinterest, which is the popularity of pins on Pinterest that have the text vegan in the description. And we can see, and this is by county, and so it's pretty obvious, like West Coast, Northeast, and looks like maybe Southern Florida, much more popular vegan pins than the rest of the Southeast, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. And this is something that like we pulled together kind of on a whim just to see if we could do it. And this type of like hyper granularity is only possible because you have like every scrap of data that exists for like every single event over a really long time scale. Like you could not make this graph even 15 years ago. Like it'd be really, really hard. And so it's just incredible to see how incredibly powerful data can be, to give you some really deep insight into, sort of macro trends like this. So back to that growth product manager role. So I arrive at Pinterest early 2013. We're 80 employees. This is the entirety of Pinterest. I took this, I think, my second week there. And this is all of Pinterest at that moment. We were 80 people, and we had one golden retriever named Rocky. And this is no exaggeration. Like, this is all of engineering. This is all of product. This is all of design. This is all of legal. This is all of finance. This is all of HR. Like, there wasn't like another office where we could go get like engineers from. So they were like, we need to figure out this email thing, but you get 2 engineers and no designers, and we're gonna give you a goal. Good luck. And I was like, oh boy, like I don't know anything about emails. I don't know anything about push notifications. This is gonna be fun. So I was like, all right, we got to find some low-hanging fruit, really low-hanging fruit, because I don't have a whole lot of time to like mess around with something that's going to take, months or quarters. So we sent this weekly email, and maybe some of you have actually received this at some point, that has weekly recommendations, and we sent it every Sunday. There was really no rhyme or reason to the time of day. like when we sent it, it was like server load combined with a bunch of other random factors. Like sometimes we sent it at 2 p.m., sometimes we sent it at 8 p.m., and people would get it all throughout the day. And we thought, well, maybe there's some optimization to make there, but maybe we can just, send it all at 8 a.m. And so we started putting some data, and it just didn't seem like there was really any consistency there. We didn't feel like there would really be, enough, improvement to make it worthwhile. But what we did notice was that if you open the email last Sunday at 3 p.m., you're pretty likely to open it the next Sunday at 3 p.m. And so we saw some consistency there, and we said, well, what if we made sure that we always sent it 30 minutes before the time of day that you last opened it. So if you last opened at 3 p.m., we'll send it to you at 2:30 p.m. next Sunday. And what do you know? 20% lift. Awesome. This was probably the biggest thing we did that quarter on my team. And it was, I think, one of the very first things we did. And we were ecstatic because I was thinking, like, this is one of the first projects I ever have as a product manager. This was easy. Like, this is not that hard. Like, well, I don't understand, like, why people are telling me product management's hard. Like, I just did it. Like, why do I, like, come on, guys, get it together. But as time went on, I really came to understand that data has a lot of issues, and working with data has just more issues than you could even imagine. And that is that, but it kind of falls into 3 buckets. Like, data is only good as the questions you ask. Like, if you ask really ambiguous questions or really ambiguous hypotheses, like, you're going to get back really ambiguous answers at best, and at worst, you're going to get back really misleading answers. And then the next point that I kind of observed is that data is only as good as it's recorded, and this is really more of an engineering thing, but at Facebook and at Pinterest, we had so many logging problems. I can't tell you how many times we wanted to do something, or we thought that, we were like, oh man, this is great, and then it's like, oh, the logging's wrong. It's like, it happened all the time. And so recording data is actually really hard. And then I think this next point is really what matters to all of you, is that even if you have perfect data, and that last example is like a really cookie cutter example, but it really can't tell you what to do next. And I think I saw a Medium article shared in the Slack channel that pointed out that data isn't vision, and I really like that. Data cannot actually tell you what to do next. It can perhaps tell you something about the way that people are interacting with your products. It can give you a snapshot into behavior, but it can't actually make that decision for you. And often I see that product managers kind of rely on that as a crutch and say, well, the data this, the data that, and it's like, it can't make that decision for you. You really have to think about that long-term vision. So some common failure patterns I've seen with data that I'll kind of go through these with some examples, but this plot, so this is, in the early days of Pinterest, we had a very robust experimentation framework, and we would generate a 75-page PDF for every single experiment. This is one of the pages, and there's 49 subplots. There's 7 different metrics, and then I think 7 different platforms listed here. So now just imagine you've just asked some ambiguous question. You have some really ambiguous hypothesis. How can you tease apart what's happening when you have 75 pages of metrics, right? So you have to be really crystal clear about what exactly you're trying to measure. I can't tell you how many times I've advised startups or I've talked to startups, and they tell me, so next quarter, what we think is that engagement is going to increase if we invest in our mobile app. Well, okay, that's great. What part? Is it because you're going to make a better feed? Is it because you're going to, roll out some new push notification types? Is it because, you have some other, like, you're going to launch messaging? Like, what exactly are you going to test? Because so often what you want to know is actually, well, does the feed increase engagement, or does push notifications increase engagement? Once you kind of decompose your assumptions, it becomes a lot easier to test, a lot easier to say, whether or not an individual thing is driving, your overall, company metrics. The next point we'll talk about in some more details, but I think that all of us as product managers think a lot about success metrics. Like, how are we going to measure success? But equally important is how are you going to measure failure? And that's often not really talked about, or it's assumed that the success metric is also the failure metric, but they are not one and the same. And we'll go through some examples of this that's really bitten me a few times. And this last one is just that, I mean, myself included, even working in data science, is that humans are just really bad at statistics. Like, it's really hard to look at a single number and know what distribution, underlies that, or what p-value means, or confidence intervals. It's really hard, and I think it's doubly hard for a product manager that's in charge of, umpteen different sub-projects and has to skim the surface of lots of things to keep that context in their head about, oh, well, this graph actually means this, it actually means that. And so, this is some of the things that I've seen is that, I've been in meetings with executives at Pinterest where we're discussing these stats, and it slowly emerges that someone thinks that a metric means something that it doesn't, and that was actually the root of disagreement. And so it's really, really hard, I think, for people to kind of keep statistics and context in their head about all these different ways that these things are measured and recorded. So fast forward about a year from the previous example, and now I'm starting to encounter some real issues. I was in charge of notifications at the time. And again, small team. I think at that point I had 3 engineers and a quarter of a designer, so not much more resources. We're launching like 100 experiments a quarter. So it's just like, launch stuff, see if it works, ship it. Launch stuff, see if it works, ship it. And we have limited ability to change the product functionality. We have no mobile engineers, so really playing on the periphery of these growth mechanics, basically. And we said, well, how can we make these notifications better? And is there some opportunity here? And so we look at this and we say, well, right now, if you pin something from someone else's board, or someone pins something from your board. So if I have a board of like VW Beetles and Tom comes along and he pins that, well, I get a notification and it sends me back to my own pin, and I get to see that the count went up by 1, and yay me, we felt like that was a really missed opportunity, since we felt like the platform is really about discovery and discovering new content. So we said, well, this seems like a missed opportunity. What if we sent you, instead to your own pin, right, and you get to see that number went up by 1. What if we sent you to that other board, right? Like that piece of content that you liked went somewhere else. Like, you're probably gonna like that. And so we had, okay, well, let's test it, right? And let's think about this hypothesis. So the hypothesis was like, okay, if we do this, board follows will go up. They'll go to that board and they'll follow that board. Okay, let's try it out. So this is the experiment dashboard. I'm not gonna spend too much time talking about this, other than to say that blue is good and red's bad, and what we care about is consistency in either one for different metrics. And what we saw was followers is up. It's up a lot. And we looked at this and we said, hypothesis confirmed. We've done our jobs. Like, this looks great. Ship it. I mean, I don't really see any reason to not ship this. We spent, 30 minutes discussing this experiment, and we were like, all right, looks awesome, let's do it. Then the feedback came, and it came like an avalanche. The new notification system is horrible. I've barely been on Pinterest now because it's so frustrating. Please change it back to showing which pin of mine was pinned. Why would I care which board they pinned it to? Then the blog started on places like brand failure, and it said, Pinterest appears to be testing what you see notifications, along with the screenshot I just showed you. It's actually where I got it from. And then, no more Pinterest for now, we are ignored. Notifications to return as before. Okay. So clearly there's a little bit of a disconnect here, right? Like, I looked at this dashboard, and then I look at this, and I'm just going, what is going on here? I've never seen this before. So we spent a little bit of time chewing on it, and what it really came down to is a few things, right? Like, there was really no way for them to tell us that they didn't like this, inside the product. You have to have some mechanism inside the product to tell you it's bad, and instead they were just kind of screaming at us. via blog posts and via Facebook posts. And then once you change people's expectations of how core behavior works on the product, like it can be really difficult. And I'm sure every UX person in here is like, duh. But this was a learning experience for me, in terms of trying to change something that was actually pretty key inside the product, rather haphazardly. And I think that the last point here is just that it can be really difficult to anticipate all of the different ways that you can fail if you don't measure them. And that's not to say that I think that we perhaps could have instrumented some metric to tell us that this was bad, but I think it's important to know that, hey, if users don't like this, we probably don't have a way to know. So let's be really sensitive to user feedback that's coming in. Even if we ran the same experiment today at Pinterest, I'm not sure that you could actually detect that all these users were going to come at us like this, because there actually is not a great way to know. But I think that's fine. You just have to know that, hey, we don't know, how users might react to this, so let's invest in user testing or something like that. So fast forward about another year, and I'm focused on building out our ad systems, ad relevance. So I'm looking at ad revenue, I'm looking at CTR, I'm looking at our CPCs on just hourly basis. And so I have this dashboard. It has 25 graphs, and we're in charge of all these metrics, right? Because we're basically trying to grow this revenue number. And one of the things we're in charge of is this hide rate. And for those of you who don't know, any piece of content on Pinterest has a little thing that you can go in and you can hide it. So you can say, I don't like this, and get this out of my feed. And we take this as a pretty strong signal to mean that you actually don't like the content we're putting in front of you. And this is a pretty big deal because it's actually a somewhat rare event. And so it's kind of a big deal to see that the hide rate goes up. And this hide rate was just total number of hides on ads over the total number of ad impressions, just raw aggregate metric. And we're watching this thing go up and up and up. It's never the biggest priority. We're just so focused on revenue. And then it gets up to here, I don't know, sometime September, near the height of this thing. And the president of the company and CEO are just you guys got to figure out what's going on. Are we getting worse at showing ads to users? Are there spammy ads in the system? So we set up this whole SWAT team of we're just sit in a war room, we're gonna pull down all these bad ads, we're gonna review everything 3 times. And what we found was there really wasn't any consistency. We could not find, we found 10 bad ads. There just wasn't really consistency in what was driving this hide rate. And so we said, well, maybe it's not the ads, maybe it's the users. Who's hiding these things? And once we flipped it around, we saw, maybe there's different behavior buckets. Maybe there's users that hide a lot, maybe there's users that hide a little. And what we found is that if you just broke it out and you said, okay, we're gonna make a group called Superhiders, and these people hide 100 ads a week, like crazy, they really just don't like ads. And we saw is that their hides are just exponential. Everyone else's flat. And we're okay, well, that seems like an interesting thing we should know, but then how big are these groups? And what we saw was something like this, never, the users, so all users that see ads, the never hide was 96%, and then it was rarely hide, so maybe you hide once a year or once every 6 months. It was 2 or 3%, and then it was 0.5% of people were these super hiders. And these are the people that it's not that they didn't like the content, it's that they don't like ads. We're not gonna win this battle, and that in the path to solution, the path to solving that hide rate issue really stems from dealing with these users, not all users. And so, if we hadn't pulled this data, we would have gone down a very different path in terms of how we dealt with this hide rate issue. But because we identified that, oh, this super hiders group is the issue, well, now we can actually come up with a pretty tailor-made solution just for that bucket of users without impacting everyone else's experience, without harming our revenue stream. So lessons learned. Averages are not distributions, and this is a really, really cool plot that I really love, and it's called the Datasaurus Dozen. And at the top, there's a plot that looks like a dinosaur, and the rest of these plots are all sort of different shapes and different plots, and they look very varied, right? Like none of these are the same. All of these plots, including the dinosaur one, have the exact same average on the x-axis, the exact same average on the y-axis, the exact same standard deviations, the exact same correlation coefficients. So if I told you that the average was 47.83 on the y-axis, you actually don't know which graph I'm talking about. And this is what bit us, right, is that we assumed that there was some like very even distribution of behavior that was going up, and in fact we had something that was very skewed. And so this is just, a call out, for the last bullet point. Just you have to be really skeptical of overall averages and aggregate metrics, because what underlies them matters, because it really does impact product decisions that you will make. And another takeaway here is just that we didn't focus on types of users. We didn't focus on, hey, there's users that hide a lot, there's users that hide a little from the get-go. Instead, we just thought that some aggregate metric would tell us all we needed to know. And clearly, we were almost led astray into, perhaps, quarters or years worth of work based on that metric. But once we kind of decomposed what was really going on, it became really apparent that there's different types of users and different buckets of behavior. So, best practices, clearing the fog. And these bullet points, I would say, all of the advice I'll tell you for these really depend on the scale and size of your company and how your product works, but I think that the general rules are still valuable regardless of how your company operates. The first is to have some sort of product launch review, experiment review, where you say, we're launching this, or we want to experiment with this, in a very, very crisp and clean way. You have some hypothesis, right? Whether it's, you're adding some feature because you think you're going to sell more licenses, or you're adding some feature because you think it's going to increase engagement. I think it's really important to start off with some hypothesis, because then you can point back at that at some point and say, are we actually doing the thing we said we were doing, or are we doing something else? And I can't tell you how many times we thought, we had some hypothesis, came up with it, and it's like, we think that we're going to drive, clicks up, and it's like some other metric goes up, and you're like, what is going on? So I think it's really, really important to be really clear about what your hypothesis is. The next point is really, I say document your data, and I'm sure all of you are sitting there going like, oh my gosh, that sounds awful. The takeaway here is not really just like, oh, well, this metric means this. I think it's important to have an understanding of, what are you really trying to get out of a certain graph or a certain metric? Like, all right, you have some, thing of hide rate or whatever your version is of that. Like, why is this important? Like, why should we care? And I think that having that common knowledge across your team, across your company is important, because then everyone can say like, well, if what you care about is, bad, ad behavior on your system, well, there's actually a way better way to do this. So just having that common understanding of what your data means for your organization is really important. And then the last point, I spent the last 2 points kind of talking about, lean into your data. But the last point is really, know your limitations with your data. There's a lot of things that you can do with data to improve your products that maybe can't be measured in the short term. Maybe it's a long-term thing. Like maybe what you're going to do is improve your product so much that it's going to change behavior, but it's going to take a year, right? Like it's part of some long-term vision, and that's fine. Like that's totally fine to say that we know that we don't have a good way to measure this. Huge redesigns that we took on at Pinterest were actually really hard to measure what the impact was, because it's kind of one of these things you sort of do it all at once. I think that's fine. You just have to be really diligent about saying we know that we don't know this, rather than just throwing your hands up and saying like, well, we can't measure it, so I'm not going to bother even documenting it. So yeah, just know its limitations and think long term. Try and harness it, and just be really diligent about working with data. That's kind of the main point of all of this. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
find that there were groups of people in different companies that were especially helpful in coming up with metrics? You know, was it talking with developers sometimes? They have different ideas for metrics and business people, or who have you found is good to involve in what metrics to include?
Yeah, so the question is like, who should you involve in that process of developing metrics, and who's best to lean on within the organization? I find that you actually need two different constituents. I think you need whoever you call your analyst and data science group, and I think you also need your executive product group. I think it's important to understand what the organization needs from that executive and product group, and then you also need to understand what's possible from the analyst and data science group. That group is going to have a pretty good sense of the way the data is structured, what you can measure, what you can't measure, and the best ways to do it. So I think it's really kind of bringing those two groups together and seeing where you can find some overlap in terms of what's possible and what's needed.
You mentioned earlier you had the group of people who hated your change notifications, but you also had data that said, hey, this is a great idea. Do you ever find situations where, you know, get 1 million likes, we'll go back to the old Facebook, and then like a week later, they're like, oh, never mind. Like, because that happens, right? There's something changed, I'm upset, but actually, how do you make those kind of decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how do you make decisions when you really have this feedback data that says one thing and you have sort of the raw data that says another? I think it really comes back to the long-term vision. You know, if we had some sort of long-term vision for that way that notification change dovetailed into some product strategy for us over the next year or two, I don't think we would have changed it. But it was really kind of a one-off isolated thing. I think you have to take user feedback sometimes with a little bit of grain of salt if it's part of some long-term strategy, and know that it's going to change. I mean, I think about like Facebook in the early days. People hated newsfeed, right? It was, you know, almost universally panned as like a terrible thing, but I mean, it's basically changed the company. And so I think it's important to think, you know, is this actually something that is going to be foundational to the future of the product, or is it just something we're doing one-off? If it's doing one-off, you know, maybe take that feedback to heart. If it's like the hydrate thing, we're not going to stop showing ads on Pinterest. Like, that's not going to happen. So, you know, we kind of have to think about what the solution paths are depending on that. So.
In your notification example, were you able to reach out and speak with any of the users that were sending you all the hate mail after you made the change?
We talked to some users. I think we only talked to one or two. I mean, we pretty well understood why they were pissed. They made it very clear. So we did, although I don't think it was really super informative. I'm still not sure that even if we had that feedback, like some internal employees at the time were kind of like, this change is weird, but we didn't really, you know, like it didn't really sink in that like maybe this is something users are going to be pissed about, you know. So yeah, perhaps in the future, you know, they would take that to heart a little more than we did at the time.
I don't need a mic. I'm loud.
Okay. Yeah, you do.
Just going on what Mariah said. Okay.
I'll get a mic. Going on what Mariah said, do you feel like in that Pinterest example, do you feel like doing user research or usability testing would have helped find those problems earlier? And I'm sorry if that's sort of a dagger question.
I think yes. I think user research is really valuable when you're making behavioral, like core foundational changes. And probably in that case, we would have figured that out much sooner. I think the challenge, right, is that user testing is always like a really awkward setting, and like people tell you things that you don't actually see in the data at scale. And so it's really hard to kind of rely on that when you're operating a product that has tens of millions or hundreds of millions of users, when you can actually look at data and say, people might tell you, well, I would never use this, and then it's like, well, it turns out that it increases, monthly actives by 5%. So, I think it's hard sometimes for people to even know in the user testing environments what they would do or what they wouldn't do, or if they like it or if they don't like it, because it's such a confined moment in time. I will say that user testing has been most valuable for us when rolling out really brand new features and new interaction patterns that we haven't done before. Like if testing out video and whether autoplay video versus non-autoplay video is the best way to go. That's really valuable. But I think it's for day-to-day experimentation in the product. It's probably not quite as valuable at scale.
Thank you.
So one of the issues that you kind of described in the change that you did to the notifications was you were asking the wrong question from the data, for not the notifications, I'm sorry, the ads. After that, did you identify any process or kind of rules that you would apply to help you get to the right questions sooner?
Yeah, so question being, did we implement some sort of process to avoid this in the future? I think it wasn't really a process that we implemented. I think we focused a little more of our efforts on bucketing user behavior, like how many users click on 5 ads a day versus whatever. We didn't necessarily goal ourselves off of those things, but we certainly added those to our dashboard just so we had some level of, I don't want to say intuition, but we had a little more insight into what was happening behind these aggregate metrics. But I can't say that we really changed any process because of it. Going once.
Yeah, so you talked a lot about experimentation, and I was curious to how you decided when you were going to actually do a live experiment and how you weighed the cost of development time of that experiment versus user research and doing some things, preliminary prototyping, and kind of what were the risks and concerns to these experiments to your user base, and was it just not a big deal because you guys are so big you can impact? Do you mind talking around that a little bit?
So we did not really think much of running 1% experiments. Most experiments that we ran were 1 or 2% of users. And we really, I think today you'd probably find in that experiment dashboard, there's probably 500 simultaneously running experiments. I mean, every team is really empowered to run their own. I think that when we weighed the cost of should we do experiments versus experiments were always the lightest weight option. The more expensive thing was to go out and do user testing and user research. I will say 2 things similar to the previous question when user testing was most valuable. One was new markets. So looking at new markets, Brazil, Japan. A funny anecdote is that the Japanese, as some of you know, really don't like tattoos, and we have a whole category feed of tattoos. Big problem. And people literally thought that category feed was disgusting in Japan, and we had to actually remove it from all Japanese users selection of category feeds. So those types of things you really can only find if you go out there and do the actual user testing and user research. Otherwise, we really invested heavily in experimentation to kind of test out different ideas.
That kind of goes along a little bit with the last question, but I wanted to ask you about A/B testing. You talked about experiments. It sounded like they're mostly that 1% versus the 99% maybe, but can you talk a bit more about how you compared different groups of users, whether it was a formal A/B test for things that you did, or it was mostly just comparing the new to the old?
So in terms of testing an A/B versus holdouts, when I say 1%, what we would do is have a 1% enabled group, 1% holdout group. And often we would have variants. So we would have sometimes, for some experiments, 10 different variants, right? So one of the things that were done in the early days of ads was figuring out the right ad load. And so we basically had like, you know, this number of ads in the home feed, this number of ads in the home feed, this number of ads in the home feed. So we had this like long-running experiment to figure out like where the drop-offs were and, you know, what the pros and cons were. So it wasn't just like this or that. It was sometimes you would have a you know, a bunch of different options that you'd be comparing against some control group.
So you talked about how the executive team came and said, hey, we're really worried about this number, go look into it. And you came back and said, hey, you shouldn't be worried about this. Can you talk about how that conversation was, closing that loop, or if you've had other experiences where people said, no, I know this is true, regardless of what you're able to bring with the data?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Pinterest as an organization is extremely data oriented, and when we went to them and said, hey, it turns out that like this is a pretty isolated problem, and here's our path to solution, like we're just going to look at users' hide behaviors, and if they hide more than X number of things in a week, we're gonna like dial down the ad load by 5% or something like that. That was really helpful because they understood the magnitude of the problem versus, you know, all the other things our team could be working on, and we also had a path to resolution that worked pretty well, at least at the time. I have no idea if they do today, but by dialing down the ad load for those users as they hide more stuff, there was a point at which, you know, they really would see very, very, very few ads, which is really what they were trying to do. But, you know, that was a little bit of a, you know, kind of a trade-off thing. Like, well, you know, those users aren't going to see ads, but they hate them anyway. So, like, why not?
Let's do one more question, and then we'll you can attack him afterward with all the other questions.
Regarding the notification case, you said that that you didn't use usability testing to gather that to know that you needed to change something. What did you use to gather that data that told you that you needed to change notifications?
So is the question, like, why did we go and try and change notifications? So at the time, right, so I'm working on this growth team, and our job is really just to play with the mechanics of growth and figure out how we can use what's in place, add new notification types, add new email types, modify notifications. And so we really had carte blanche to try anything. And this is just, you know, one of the ideas on the like giant board of ideas. And so we were just trying to iterate through them and see what works, see what doesn't, apply those learnings, move forward. And so perhaps the kind of funny and bad thing is that we really did not think much of that experiment at the time. We thought like, this was a no-brainer, it looks good, ship it, you know, like there was not like a whole lot of consternation at the time about, oh, I don't know about this experiment. It was like, oh, it looks good, let's do it. But, you know, our goal was really just to kind of drive those growth mechanics, you know, improve MAU through different virality mechanisms.
All right, let's give another round of applause for Jeff.